Hello everyone. So there's a lot of delays. I'm sure your mock exams have already passed, and that's my bad. I've been trying to get this editing software to work for the last 2 weeks. It was actually just my webcam mic was on the whole time. So somehow, somewhere, it corrupted the file, and the microphone quality was awful. So here we are. It's EDUQAS Psychology A Level Comp 2. So C2 A1 definitions, the independent variables. So in your essays, you're going to have to, or just any answers for Comp 2. To be honest, Comp 2 is the easiest because you can literally memorize all of these and you will guarantee that you will at least get a high B/A. If you just memorize all of these definitions and make yourself comfortable with the mathematical aspects, so graphical representation, how to draw graphs, how to read graphs, how to read correlations, etc., you will get an A in your exam. So independent variable, the variable that the psychologist manipulates and controls to see how it affects behavior. The dependent variable or dependent variables, the behavior which is measured, which is usually the participant's behavior by the psychologist. Covariables indicate two or more quantities being measured in a correlation by the researcher that may or may not vary with each other. So covariables are used where a causational relationship between the dependent variable and the manipulation of the independent variable cannot be established due to the nature of the experiment. So operationalization of variables, giving a precise definition to the behavior being manipulated / observed / measured, so the independent variable and dependent variable. This allows for repetition and raises reliability as it is an agreeable value that has been attributed to the measurement. Confounding variables are variables in a study that are not being measured or manipulated by the researcher that affect some participants' behavior but not others, having negative consequences for validity. So if there are confounding variables that are affecting your dependent variable, then it means that the study is not necessarily studying what it intends to. It's not the manipulation of the independent variable which is causing your results. It's outside variables that you are not accounting for and that shouldn't be affecting your results, which is why validity goes down. So the aim of the research is a broad statement of the purpose of the research. An alternative hypothesis is a testable statement that a piece of research attempts to support or reject. A testable statement, etc. These are keywords. Literally, you should be basically copy and pasting this from memory word by word. A directional hypothesis is a hypothesis that suggests that there will be a difference or relationship between variables, where the IV will affect the DV in one specific direction or outcome. So for example, that alcohol slows reaction time. A non-directional hypothesis is a hypothesis that suggests that there will be a difference / relationship between variables, but does not state a specific direction or outcome for results. For example, alcohol affects reaction time. A null hypothesis is a hypothesis that suggests that there will be no difference or relationship between variables. Any that does occur does so by chance. So for example, alcohol will have no effect on reaction time. So an experiment is a research method where cause and effect is measured through the control and manipulation of key variables, and where the participants are randomly allocated to experimental / control groups. Quasi-experiments are a research where the experimenter has not deliberately manipulated the IV and participants are not randomly allocated. Methods within this category include natural experiments and difference studies. Natural experiments are a research method where the IV arises naturally, although the DV can still be measured in a laboratory or any other location of the researcher's choice. This method would still be used where it is unethical to directly manipulate the IV. Participant observations are a research method where the researcher takes on the role of the participant whilst observing other participants' behavior around them. Non-participant observations are a research method where the researcher watches and records participants' behavior without interfering in any way, so from a distance. Feel free to pause, by the way, after each thing, because I'm going to be going through these relatively quickly. So content analysis is a research method which involves exploration of ideas to see what categories, codes, or themes emerge, and tallying each time a material fits a theme. It converts qualitative data into quantitative data so that it can be more easily compared. Structured interviews are a research method that includes standardized questions, like in a questionnaire, which are known as an interview schedule and are usually asked face-to-face. Questionnaires are a research method that includes a list of written questions, which generate closed and or open answers. These can be used in person, online, or through other methods, so for example, postal. Semi-structured interviews are a research method which involves asking participants questions, usually face-to-face. These can be in the form of an interview schedule, but could also include follow-up questions to expand on answers of the questions asked. Correlational studies are a research method which involves comparing two continuous variables, so covariables, to see if there is an association or relationship between them. case studies are a method which involves an in-depth investigation of a phenomenon, which uses a descriptive analysis of a person, group, or event. It is a holistic study through one or more methodologies that is usually longitudinal. So, for example, Bobby's 44 Thieves, they use case studies. So, self-reports are a method which involves a participant reporting on their own thoughts and feelings through methods such as interviews or questionnaires. Quantitative data is a type of data that can be measured numerically by the psychologist so that statistical analyses can be completed. So, for example, scores on an IQ test. Qualitative data is a type of data that can be observed but not measured numerically. It usually takes the form of words, thoughts, and feelings, and is difficult to analyze. So, for example, a participant's feeling about school. Primary sources. Information sources / data that is directly collected by the researcher itself firsthand. So, for example, they collect data through a questionnaire, experiment, interviews, etc. for their research. Secondary sources are information sources or data that have not been directly collected / created by the researcher. So, for example, the use of methods such as content analyses of existing data or literature reviews. Cross-sectional studies are a method which involves comparing one group of participants representing a cross-section of society against another at the same point in time. Brain scans are a research method which involves taking images of the living brain to investigate brain function. So, for example, PET scans, fMRI scans, and CAT scans or CAT scans. Longitudinal studies / research are a method which involves conducting research over a long period of time in order to observe long-term effects of X on a specific behavior. X being just a placeholder for any sort of thing that a researcher is studying. It may utilize a range of other methodologies such as case studies, interviews, etc. Conducting research in a laboratory environment. A location of research where scientific research and measurement can be taken using specialist large equipment. Conditions and variables are controlled, and procedures are standardized. Conducting research online. A location of research where participants are accessed via the internet / social networks / mobile apps, etc. This often includes questionnaires but can also be experimental, correlational, etc. So now on to sampling techniques. This is going to be about 2 or 3 slides long, so just prepare for mayhem. So target populations, the group of individuals that a researcher is interested in studying. So, for example, people in the UK. Sampling frames is a group / population that is identified when it is unrealistic to study the whole target population. So, for example, people in London. Random sampling is a sampling technique where participants are selected from the sampling frame where everyone has an equal chance of being selected. So, for example, names are pulled out of a hat where a computer is used to randomly select participants. Opportunity sampling is a sampling technique where participants are selected at the researcher's convenience without knowing any details about the sample in advance. So, for example, picking people who were there at the time in your specific location. Systematic sampling is a sampling technique where every nth person on a list is selected by the researcher. So, for example, every 3rd house on a street or 5th person on a register. Stratified sampling is a sampling technique where the target group is divided into subgroups, so for example by sex, and then the participants are selected randomly from each subgroup. Quota sampling is a sampling technique where the target population is divided into subgroups, so for example by sex, and then the participants are chosen from each subgroup at the convenience of the researcher. Self-selected sampling is a sampling technique where participants volunteer, so select themselves, for research. So, for example, they come forward or respond to the psychologist after reading an advertisement in a newspaper or on a notice board. Snowball sampling is a sampling technique where participants are initially recruited by the psychologist, and then those participants recruit further participants from people they know. Therefore, the sample group appears to snowball. So if you look at the imagery, when a snowball is rolling down snow, it picks up mass and snow sticks to it, so it gets bigger over time. That's essentially the mentality behind the phrasing. So, observational sampling techniques, a sampling technique that is used to collect data about specific behaviors or events within specific time frames. Event sampling, where participants are observed by the psychologist who records a specific behavior or event each time it occurs to create a total score. Time sampling is where the psychologist observes and records behavior such as a score at specific time intervals, so for example every 15 minutes, and then creates an average score for each participant being observed. Independent groups, an experimental design where participants take part in only one experimental condition. Repeated measures, an experimental design where participants take part in both the control and experimental conditions. Matched pairs design is a form of independent groups design where the experimental and control participants are deliberately similar. So, for example, there is a balance between gender and IQ levels in each group/condition. Nominal data is the level of measurement that shows categories of data represented by frequencies. The data sets have no relative numerical value, so for example, boys and girls. Ordinal data is the level of measurement where data can be placed into ascending or descending order, but the intervals between data are not necessarily equal. So for example, the times for first, second, and third in a race. Interval data is a level of measurement that has an equal numerical intervals between scores, so the increments are the same. So the interval/increments between 1 and 2 degrees is the same as between 12, 21, and 22 degrees, or it could be 1,000,000 degrees and 1,000,001 degree, but the difference is still 1 degree. Ratio data, the level of measurement that has an equal intervals between scores and has an absolute or true 0 point, so speed, miles per hour. Obviously, you cannot have negative speed unless if you tamper with some unknown quantum physics. At the same time, if you're looking at temperature scales such as Kelvin, then you can't have minus Kelvin. 0 is absolute 0. If you're measuring height, for example, you cannot have negative centimeters. It stops at 0 centimeters. Now, whether something like measuring the depth of water, that might differ. There might be a negative feet to represent how below sea level you are, but generally speaking, it's things with an absolute 0 point, as the definition has said. So things like speed, temperature in Kelvin, not Celsius or Fahrenheit, but temperature in Kelvin, speed, height, weight. I suppose you can't weigh negative kilograms, at least within my own intellectual chops. I don't think you can. Correct me if I'm wrong. But internal reliability is the extent to which a test or measure is consistent within itself. So for example, the use of a standardized instructions or procedure for all participants. External reliability is the extent to which a test produces consistent results over several occasions. Ways of dealing with reliability is a measure which improves consistency and accuracy within the results. So for example, the use of a standardized procedure or measures such as counterbalancing. Accessing reliability are measures used to check the consistency of a set of results. Inter-rater reliability is where 2 or more psychologists produce consistent results by using a standardized procedure, agreed coding system, or correlation of their data. Test-retest reliability involves testing and retesting the same participants over time with the same test and comparing their scores. If the scores are the same, then the test has external reliability. Split half reliability involves splitting a participant's test answers in half and seeing whether he or she got the same or similar scores on the 2 halves. If so, internal reliability is high. If not, it is low and individual questions would need to be redesigned. So, internal reliability, the findings are accurate and the effects of the DV are caused by the IV. Therefore, the study measures what it intends to measure, as confounding variables have been controlled and will not affect the results. External validity is whether the study paints a true picture of real-life behaviours. So for example, if the tasks have mundane realism and whether the findings would apply to different places, different times, or different people, so population validity. Specific validity issues are factors which could cause problems with validity, such as researcher bias, social desirability bias, and demand characteristics. Researcher bias is where the researcher either directly or indirectly influences the results of a study through the process of designing the study or through the way the research is conducted or analysed. Demand characteristics are a type of confounding variable where participants unconsciously work out the aim and act differently, either through social desirability or the screw you effect. So the screw you effect is likely, I have never come across this, even in my psychology lessons I wasn't taught this. This is no fault of the teacher, of course, it's just obviously not every nook and cranny can be, but self-explanatory. It's likely just, here's how it goes. You're a participant in an experiment. You figure out what the experimenter or the researcher is trying to study, and purposefully, you go against it. So you try and skew the results on purpose. So that's the screw you effect. Likewise, or I should say conversely, the social desirability bias or succumbing to social desirability bias would be the opposite. So conforming towards what the experiment is trying to find, or conforming towards what you would believe as socially desirable. So if you're in a structured interview, or if you're in any sort of interview or questionnaire, if there's a question that may paint you in a bad light, if you give your honest answer, you may change your answer, or you may lie so that you don't look like a bad person, essentially. You don't sound like a bad person. And while technically and realistically your results are going to be kept anonymous, it's, I suppose, that sense of subconscious guilt by answering the question that causes you to lie in your answer. So, ways of dealing with issues of validity: improving validity through methods such as double or single blind procedures, or through changing the location or nature of the research tasks to make them more reflective of real life. So, when you're memorizing these definitions, you should integrate it into your own thought process. So during my time at college, I always said to my peers, some of them anyway, I said that it's so important that you begin to think like your subject, and that helps you to just naturally just speak, right? So, for example, if in your everyday life you do not think about psychology a single time throughout your entire day, like for 365 days a year, or for every single day that you're not at school or college, right? Or university or wherever, this is relative to each subject, you will not reach the same level of proficiency in that subject compared to somebody who does think about it. So let's say you're watching a TV show, or let's say you're watching like Criminal Minds or NCIS or CSI or something like that, where there is a study, or they're collecting evidence from a crime. If you can identify that, wait, hold on, that's not right, that's not internally valid, or hold on, that's not right, that's not externally valid, or there's a lack of population validity here, because, or it's not representative because the population is all middle class white people, or conversely the population is or lower class black people or lower class Asian people. If you can identify these issues and integrate it into your own thought process where you can see it in the real life, then it makes it a lot easier, because then you can just be asked in a random scenario, what's social desirability bias, by the way, and you'll be able to answer it because it's just naturally something that because you've chosen these subjects at A level. It should be something that you enjoy doing, and even if you don't, try your best to enjoy it. But that's besides the point, that it should become kind of like a hobby for you. So if somebody who was interested in psychology asked me like, what's social desirability bias or what's demand characteristics, I would be able to answer it because I'm interested in psychology. And most people who study psychology, I think anyway, are interested in it. So that can help you with memorizing these things. So assessing validity, methods of checking the internal or external validity of a study. Concurrent validity is validating a measurement by comparing it with an established measurement that has known validity. If similar results occur on both tests, then this new test is valid. If not, then the new test would have to be redesigned and tested. Construct validity is the most sophisticated test of validity, as it looks at whether the overall results reflect the phenomena as a whole, so external validity. Checking the existing definitions of the behavior being studied and redesigning the test if it measures a different construct. Content validity, this objectively checks the method of measuring behavior is accurate and decides whether it is a fair test that achieves the aims of the study, so internal validity. I'm about to mix the two words, validity and reliability. So afterwards, you would ask an expert in that specific area of behavior to check the test is valid. So predictive validity is the degree to which a test accurately forecasts a future outcome on a more broadly related topic. Do the findings apply in different and more varied situations? So for example, do those with high IQ scores gain higher grades in exams? Face validity is the least sophisticated measure of validity. This validity is simply whether the test appears to measure what it claims to, and hence is subjective. Tests whether the purpose is clear, even to naive respondents, are said to have this validity. So ethics now. So ways of dealing with ethical issues or managing the risk posed by ethical issues. These are methods such as ethical guidelines or the ethics committee. So ethical guidelines, these provide a set of moral principles that guide research from its inception through to completion and publication of results. The ethics committee is the board that is in place to ensure that proposed research meets the standards of the current ethical codes of conduct and guidelines. In my notes, these two definitions were switched around, and logically it doesn't make sense to read it if the definitions are switched. So to be honest, I'd double check that and make sure that these words and definitions, just for these two anyway, correspond with each other. But I'm almost certain that this is correct. So debriefing is a method which aims to ensure participants are aware of the true nature of the study, so overcoming any deception. It should return the participant back to their original state. So the chi-squared test is a statistical test that is used when the experimental design is independent groups when the level of data is nominal and when the hypothesis is predicting a difference between variables. The observed value must be higher than the critical value for results to be considered statistically significant. The Mann-Whitney U-test is a statistical test that is used when the experimental design is independent groups, when the level of data is at least ordinal, and when the hypothesis is predicting a difference between variables. The critical value must be higher than the observed value for results to be significant. So sign test, a statistical test that is used when the experimental design is repeated measures or matched pairs, when the level of data is nominal, and when the hypothesis is predicting a difference. The critical value must be higher than the observed value for results to be considered statistically significant. The Spearman's rank order correlation coefficient is a statistical test that is used when the level of data is at least ordinal and is related, and when the hypothesis is predicting a correlation or relationship between variables, so not a causal one. The observed value must be higher than the critical value for results to be considered statistically significant. The Wilcoxon's matched pairs signed ranks test is a statistical test that is used when the experimental design is repeated measures / matched pairs, when the level of data is at least ordinal, and when the hypothesis is predicting a difference between variables. The critical value must be higher than the observed value for results to be significant, statistically significant, I should say. Probability values are a numerical value that gives an indication of the likelihood that results are due to a real difference or correlation and not due to chance. So, for example, in psychology, we accept a probability rate of 95%, where results are due to chance in 5% of cases. There's a 5% chance, 5% probability that results are due to chance. So statistical levels are a numerical value that is usually expressed in value including 2 decimal places. This level tells you the margin of error that could occur in your results. So for example, 0.05 suggests that there is a 5% probability that results are due to chance and not the difference or correlation between variables. Observed, so calculated values, are the numerical value that is created as a result of inferential statistical analyses of your data. This will be compared to the critical values for the test to calculate the level of significance. Critical values from tables. These are the tabulated numerical values that have been assigned to a particular inferential statistical test. It is compared to the observed value for your set of data to calculate significance. Frequency tables. These are a chart or table that shows the rate of occurrence of frequency for a number of measured values or categories. Graphical representations are a range of diagrams that show the rate of occurrence for a number of measured values or categories. Bar charts are a diagram that represents frequencies of non-continuous data. Line graphs are a diagram that shows a linear representation of frequencies of data. Histograms, however, are a diagram that represents the distribution of frequencies for discrete or continuous data. Pie charts. These are a diagram or diagrams that represents data proportionally as part of a whole picture of responses. Scatter diagrams are a diagram that represents a relationship or correlation between 2 or more covariables. Distribution curves. These are linear representations of data that include a mean, median, and modal score to show a spread of data. Normal distribution. These are a type of distribution where the mean, median, and mode are equal. This can be referred to as a bell curve. Negative skewed distribution. These are a type of skewed distribution where the mode is greater than the mean. A positive skewed distribution. These are a type of skewed distribution where the mode is less than the mean, so the mean is greater. So measures of central tendency. These are a form of estimation of a midpoint or average in a set of data. So the mean is the average that is shown by all scores in the set when they are divided by n. So n being the total amount of values in the set, not the total value, but the total amount of value. So if you have like 67, 55, 35, 1, and 2, n would be 5 because that's the total amount of values in your set, not the total value. So the median is the midpoint in a set of data that has been placed in order. So you get a set of values, you put it in numerical order, ascending order, so lowest to highest or smallest to biggest, and then you just choose the middle value. So let's say you have 9 values, you choose the first 4, the last 4, and then whichever one is left, that's the one in the middle. You should be able to see it as well. So the mode is the most common value within a set of data. Measures of dispersion, however, these are a measure that shows the spread of data, whether it is tightly clustered or has a broader spread. The range is a value which shows the spread of data, representing the difference between the lowest and highest scores. Standard deviation, these are a value which represents the amount of variation of results from the mean score. So exam questions that you could get, so describe the process of peer review. I think this might be 6 marks or so, not entirely sure, 5, 6 marks. So number 1, A researcher submits an article to a journal. Number 2, the journal is then assessed by the editor of the journal. If accepted by the editor, the article is then sent to reviewers who are also experts in the field, or if it's singular, who is an expert in the field. Number 4, reviewers are normally kept anonymous from the article's author. Number 5, reviewers submit their comments to the editor. Number 6, editors may reject the article or return it to the author to make revisions. Number 7, the revised article is resubmitted to the editor for publication. So number 7 is dependent on the act of the editor. If the editor rejected it, if the editor accepted it, then number 7 doesn't exist. But if they reject it or return it to the author, then number 7 exists. So that arrow there with the line underneath means less than or equal to. That arrow there, no line underneath, just means more than. If it was to have a line underneath, then it would mean more than or equal to. Likewise, if the top symbol didn't have a line underneath, it would just mean less than. So this will get you 2 marks for something like define test, retest, or reliability. So this involves testing and retesting the same participants over time with the same test and comparing their scores. If the scores are the same, then the test has external reliability. Inter-rater reliability, where 2 or more psychologists produce consistent results by using a standardized procedure, agreed coding system, or correlation of their data. So explain the steps you would follow to carry out standard deviation. I would calculate the standard deviation by completing the following steps. Number 1, calculate the mean of the dataset. Number 2, take the mean away from each score in the dataset. Number 3, square each difference. Number 4, add together each of the squared differences. Number 5, divide this by n minus 1, so n being the number of scores in your dataset minus 1. Number 6, find the square root of this value, and this is a standard deviation. This would help you as well. Just memorizing this is a step-by-step tutorial on how to do standard deviation. So if you don't understand how to do it, then there you go. So explain one strength and one weakness of using standard deviation in psychology. Do not write all of these. Write one of each. Please, in your exams, write one of each. But this is just giving you an optional flexibility of what to use. Or even if, let's say you have like I'm not sure really. Let's say you have like a surprise essay-based question or something like that. I'm not sure. You won't get essay-based questions. But like, let's say you have a scenario question where there's standard deviation and you have to look for weaknesses of it. You can maybe look for one of these, and these are actual points you can use in real scenarios. So one strength is a more precise and informative measure of dispersion in the range. This highlights if the mean is an appropriate measure of central tendency. This is used in further statistical analyses such as computing skewness. This is less affected by anomalous data or anomalous results than range scores. This is because standard deviation, an anomalous result, you can see it and you can see its impact, rather than the range where you can't necessarily tell if there's an anomalous result if you haven't seen the original data set. Well, you can probably tell necessarily, I suppose, but it's less obvious. So a weakness, it can only be used if the dataset is normally distributed and not skewed. It's more difficult to calculate than the range score. It can only be used when data collected is ordinal level or above. This can only be used where an independent variable is plotted against frequency. Explain the strength of longitudinal studies and the weaknesses of cross-sectional studies. So this depends on the marks of the question. So if it's a 4-mark question, then you would do 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses. If it's a 2-mark question, 1 strength and 1 weakness. Or if you have enough time, 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses. If it's a 6-mark question, 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses. If you've got more time, 4 strengths and 4 weaknesses. But that's only if you have more time, if you only have chance to spare. Luckily in C2, there's no 24 markers, so you can blitz through most of these really quickly, and you'll find at the end of the exam you should, to be honest, have a lot of time if you've memorized these definitions. If you've memorized these to an absolute T, then you'll absolutely speed through the exam. But don't let that give you a false sense of confidence. Go through your exam until you get bored out of your mind. So longitudinal studies control for participant variables, as the same person is tested on a number of occasions and compared, and therefore acts as their own control. Cohort variables are not a problem. This reduces recall bias, as participants are being researched as their life occurs, rather than research which may ask them to think back to experiences that they may have had a long time ago. This helps us to understand the order in which events may occur, so life events. This helps us to establish links between early life circumstances and later outcomes. Weaknesses of cross-sectional studies. different people are in the different groups/conditions. So any difference detected may be due to participant variables other than age. So for example, if you have somebody that's lived through life, yet they've experienced a lot of different cultures, and they've lived in many different environments, changes in behavior may be sociological rather than psychological. So somebody, for example, who's in care, if they're in a majority Afro-Caribbean household, and then they might go to a strictly French or like a very English household, right? Their behavior in their early life may be very different to their behavior in their late life, depending on which environment they're in, depending on where they grow up. So cohort variables may still exist, such as individuals being born during the same time period may share important historical experiences. Recall bias can still occur if the study asks participants about experiences they may have had a long time ago. So even a couple months or a couple weeks, there can be recall bias. So if let's say an event happens, right, since the last time that you've been studied or called for the longitudinal study, it's been a year. If you were then asked to recall events that happened a year ago, your memory is likely to be vague. And even then, if you believe that you have a totally accurate memory, there are going to be some discrepancies in your retelling of events. So, cool. So difficult. It's also difficult to indicate causal relationships, cause and effect, because there are so many confounding variables. So, using examples from psychology, discuss why primary sources may be better than secondary sources. Primary sources may be more valid than secondary sources, as the researcher has designed the investigation and the method of data collected specifically to test the hypotheses. That's my bad. So, for example, an experiment can be controlled to reduce or eliminate the effect of extraneous variables. Primary sources may be more ethical than secondary sources, as the researcher has control over how participants are recruited and tested, and can ensure that BPS, so British Psychological Society guidelines, are followed. For example, an interview of a sensitive topic can be adjusted to take into consideration any sensitive issues that arise. I would give an example of this afterwards. So it could include things like, anything that may arise in insecurity or childhood, or how they were raised, or parents, or their current health, something like that. So, however, primary sources may be more time consuming to collect and analyze data, whereas secondary data is already available. For example, existing medical data exists to examine the effectiveness of drug therapy for clinical disorders. That's something that you'll learn, and probably are learning, in your schizophrenia and ASD as well. So primary sources cannot examine historical trends, whereas secondary sources can be looked at over time to see trends and changes. For example, we can understand obedience to authority at different points in time. This is more speaking about primary sources in singular. So the same experimenter might hold experiments at different time frames. So, like, for example, I'm pretty sure Loftus and Palmer. So let's say, hypothetically, Loftus and Palmer did their study, and then 40 years later did another one, and then 20 years before that did another one, and then 60 years, and then 80 years. If they had, while they would have been long gone at 60 years, let's pretend that they did. They've technically looked at trends over time using primary sources, but it's more speaking about they would have to wait 20 years to see historical changes and trends using primary sources. So concurrent validity is validating a measurement by comparing it with an established measurement that has known validity. If similar results occur on both tests, then this new test is valid. If not, then the new test would have to be redesigned and tested. There's 2 marks. Construct validity is the most sophisticated test of validity, as it looks at whether the overall results reflect the phenomena as a whole, external validity, checking the existing definitions of the behavior being studied and redesigning the test if it measures a different construct. So, self-conducted experiment. So, this is a little note from me. I am aware that each self-conducted experiment is that the topic and themes that each self-conducted experiment is on changes each year. However, the way you answer the questions is and should be the same. So, I'm going to put my answer for each question and just substitute every answer with what's relevant and relative to your own. So, and a lot of these answers, there'll be blanks where you should fill your own. You should have gone through this in class anyway. And if my questions and answers, if they are completely different to yours, obviously follow yours, because my information is from summer 2023. But I don't think it should be any different. But I suppose it might be. It might differ on the type of experiment you did, or the research method. So, State the variables you're assessing. So you would say the independent variable is whether the participants have or have not. And then you would say the dependent variable is something measured using the scale from whatever. I put 0 to 4 because that was my scale, was the stress scale. Ours was on the relationship between pet ownership and stress. And you have to ensure that when you're stating the dependent variable, it's operationalized. So that's why I put the 0 and 4 there, because while that might not be your scale at all, your scale might be completely different, and that's fine. You just have to ensure that you include the scale so it can be shown that it could be numbered or graphically represented. So state an operationalized alternative hypothesis. There will be significantly lower something from the participants who have something compared to individuals that have something. Obviously, change this to what you want, but ensure that it's still an alternative hypothesis. So identify if your alternative hypothesis is directional or non-directional. So this is directional because I said significantly lower, so I'm stating the direction to the results. So justify/explain why you chose to use a directional or non-directional hypothesis, link it to your variables. So I chose to use a directional hypothesis as I had research supporting evidence that suggests that something from an article that was named something from whatever. I'd maybe justify a little bit more, to be honest. I don't think that sentence is entirely adequate, but it's cool. So state an appropriate null hypothesis. There will be no significant difference between something in participants who have something compared to participants who haven't something. Any difference is due to chance factors. Identify the type of methodology used in this research, and then you just say, I used something. State why you have chosen this methodology and link to your variables. So you can say, whatever you chose has a something method. Therefore, it allows for the collection of anonymous data in a time-efficient method and includes predetermined answers. Therefore, I'll be able to collect something scores via the use of something. You can tell that I haven't omitted everything because I still want you guys to see kind of how to answer it. So it being a time-efficient method and allowing predetermined answers, I'm elaborating on what I'm saying. And time-efficient methods, that is an advantage. You could probably tell it's a questionnaire / structured interview that I did. But yeah, so explain at least 2 advantages of the chosen methodology and link them to your variables. One advantage of using the something is that it produced quantitative or qualitative data. Therefore, it was easy to analyze and find patterns between the something and something. Another advantage is that it produces anonymous data. Therefore, I was able to increase the validity of something scores due to participants being more likely to be honest and not change their answers to appear socially desirable. To be honest, I probably rephrase this to be a little more professional. I would just say, the start of it's fine. Another advantage is that it produces anonymous data. Therefore, I'd say subsequently, the something validity, internal validity, external validity, whatever validity you can attach to this, is increased due to the participants being less likely to succumb to social desirability bias because, and then kind of like explain kind of what it is by just kind of saying, due to there being an increase in honest nature because they're less likely to lie, something like that. But this sentence is completely fine as well. It's completely fine. But that's just what I would do personally. So explain at least 2 limitations of your chosen methodology and link to your variables. One limitation of questionnaires is that they lack insight into the impact on something scores. This is because the questions have predetermined answers as I have used something to measure something else. Another limitation is that the questions on something and the something scores may be interpreted differently by different participants. Therefore, this would affect the internal reliability of the research. Identify the main characteristics of your sample group, and then you would say number of participants, something, and other significant features being majority of students or some adults aged something. So identify the sampling method that you employed to select your sample. So then you say you did something sampling. Explain at least 2 advantages of your choice of sampling technique and link to your research. One advantage of opportunity sampling is that it is not very time consuming to collect a sampling frame, as I did not need to highlight characteristics in a sampling frame, for example. In a stratified sampling, instead of the questionnaire allowed for the participants to be easily gathered on something or something scores. Another advantage of opportunity sampling is that it is convenient for the participants for example, the questionnaires on whatever was sent via a Microsoft online form, which they would fill out in their own time. So number 2 is more specific to my own investigation, but you can see the thought process behind it and you can attach that to your own. So explain at least 2 limitations of your choice of the sampling technique and link to your research. One limitation of opportunity sampling is that it could not produce a representative sample. For example, the questionnaire on something and something was sent out to mostly students. Therefore, more data would need to be collected to ensure that it is generalizable to wider society. Again, yours might not be opportunity sampling, and don't just substitute opportunity sampling for something else and copy and paste that. You have to make it relevant and you have to make the sentence make sense. So this part you can't really you can't necessarily copy and paste it like throughout, but you can make your own answers, and it teaches you how to answer a question like this. So another limitation of opportunity sampling is that there could have been researcher bias. For example, there should be a semicolon before the for. Some of the participants in which I gathered from the sample I'd already known personally. Therefore, there is a possibility that I would have known whether they something already or did not, and this could have influenced the something scores which they had given. Identify an appropriate descriptive statistic that could be used to Identify an appropriate descriptive statistic that could be used to describe the data collected. So for mine, it was the mean, range, and standard deviation. Explain why this choice of descriptive statistic is appropriate for your research. The mean is an appropriate measure as it allows and uses all of the stress scores, so all of the values are used. So this means that it's wholly representative of the entire data set. So the standard deviation helps to see how spread out the stress scores are for the average. The range is used to see the difference between the highest stress score versus the lowest stress scores in each category. So for example, owns a pet and doesn't own a pet. Identify an appropriate graphical representation that could be used to describe the data collected. And so that could be line graph, bar chart, whatever. Explain why your choice of graphical representation is appropriate for your research. The data is discrete/continuous, choose one. So something is appropriate to show the difference in whatever. Identify an appropriate inferential statistic test that you use to display the data collected. You just answer appropriately. Explain why your choice of inferential statistic test is appropriate for your research. I chose to use this test as the research is a test of, for example, I have investigated the difference between something scores in participants who own a pet in comparison to those who did not. In addition, I used independent measures I used the independent measures design I used the independent measures research design since all of the participants took part in one condition by completing the questionnaire on pet ownership. Also, the data produced was at least ordinal as there was a possible 0 for the scores. So, in these answers as well, you should always relate it back to your experiment. So literally, you have to rinse it. Like always say, during my questionnaire, examining so-and-so and so-and-so, like you have to always repeat that. So briefly summarize your findings. The bar chart showed the difference in mean stress scores for the participants who something in comparison to those who did not. So this is owning a pet. This is appropriate as the data produced is, and then you choose your data. So I worked out the standard deviations for the participants who have something and who have not done something, or for the participants who, I used the something test and found the observed value was something and the critical value was something. Therefore, I can reject or accept the directional hypotheses, or alternative hypotheses, and accept or reject the null hypotheses as the data was not significant. And then you state the numbers of your mean and range, and then, yeah. So state what conclusion you can draw from the findings of your research linked to your variables, as the calculated value is, which is greater or lower than the critical value of. This means that the findings are or aren't significant at p equals 0.05. Therefore, the null hypotheses can be accepted or rejected, and the alternative hypotheses accepted or rejected. This means that there is something significant difference between the participants' something scores, whether they have owned a pet or have not owned a pet. By the way, again, don't write greater slash lower in your exams. It should be either greater or lower. It's just that obviously I cannot tell you what your results are because it's impossible for me to know. I'm not omniscient. So this is why I'm just like putting greater slash lower and aren't or accepted or rejected, just to kind of capture all possibilities. So identify at least 2 issues of reliability you faced in your research linked to your variables. One issue I faced was whether I was consistent in my own behaviors. For example, using the same type of questions in the questionnaire on pet ownership and stress scores. Another issue was whether I measured pet ownership and stress scores in a consistent way. For this one, you have to be a little bit humble. You have to humble yourself a little bit, but you can even lie because they have no way of knowing, if you know what I'm saying. Obviously, if you don't write something like, I didn't finish it, because just don't write that. But like something like this, ensuring there's consistency, so the questions are standardized, that sort of thing. So explain how you established your research variable linked to your variables. I have managed to stay consistent in my own behavior by using the same type of question each time, for example, only using closed questions. In addition, each participant received the same questionnaire on pet ownership and received the same debriefing statement of the purpose of the study is to investigate the relationship between pets and stress. Also, I measured stress in a consistent way by using Cohen's perceived stress scale to make stress measurable in the same way. Identify at least 2 issues with validity you faced in your research linked to your variables. One issue with validity was that the sample was not representative. For example, the sample was of participants collected from the questionnaire on something mainly consisting of students aged 17 or 18 and adults aged 30 plus, which is not representative of all wider society. Obviously, not all people are students, not all people are 30 and above. And within the age ranges, in fact, of the participants who got. Another issue is that there may have been other factors that could have affected the participants' answers on the questionnaire about so-and-so, such as their mental state whilst completing the questionnaire. Another issue was whether the, I presume, IV or DV was operationalized. Explain how you established your research was valid, linked to your research. I managed to operationalize something by stating that something and other researchers all agreed on the same definition. I managed to measure something's scores accurately by using an established scale from whatever, causing it to be accurate. In addition, I use filler questions. So, for example, how many people live in your house, to distract away from the true aims as well as putting the something question first. I avoided social desirability bias by ensuring that the participants are anonymous, as otherwise they may change their scores. They may succumb to social desirability bias to look in a different light because of the sensitive nature of the subject. It's a questionnaire about stress, and so obviously stress can get quite personal, especially if it's caused by very personal issues. So identify at least 2 ethical issues you're concerned before your research: informed valid consent, privacy, and protection from harm. Explain what you did to deal with these ethical issues linked to your research. Informed valid consent. At the beginning of the research, we had a question saying, do you consent to this research? At the end of the research, I again asked for consent afterwards, telling them the true aims they were investigating. Privacy. All the scales remained anonymous. In addition, I used a Likert scale, which is not intrusive as it uses closed questions for stress scores. Protection from harm. The participants at the end of the questionnaire have a debrief. This allowed for the participants who could have been affected by questions on something, and that they could contact me via email in case of needing support, or otherwise their data to be destroyed.